All right. So the topic of today's design corner is figuring out the tempo of a mystery. And this is useful not only for games like East Texas University, which is kind of why we uh, where this topic originally came from, thinking about what's going to be useful for folks that are going to be running East Texas University. So it's useful in the vein of I want to run a horror game, I want to run some sort of investigation game. There's something where the players are going to have to decipher clues and find things out, and there's information that's hidden from them. And so it is going to be useful to have strategies for how do I keep that moving along? How do I make sure that they are finding out the things that they need to know? How do I make sure that the players aren't getting frustrated because they run up against a barrier all the time? And how do we make sure that when your players start piecing things together and they start figuring it out, they don't then become disappointed because they didn't figure the exact thing out? So one of the things that we kind of have to recognize first when we're going to do a horror game or a cops and robbers game or whatever type of investigative game you might be doing, and this is true for even you might be playing Deadlands, and the impetus is go investigate this town and find out what weird thing is happening in this town. It's useful across basically all genres of tabletop role playing game, and it's also something that it's a very common verb for us to throw out to our players. You have to go and investigate this thing. Well, first we have to acknowledge something as we're building stuff on this side of the GM screen, which is our players are never going to put everything together in the same way that we thought. This was something that if we jump in a time machine, go back to late 80s, early 90s, and we look at the advent of point and click adventure games, there is this notion that a lot of people struggled with of well, why didn't the player just think to click these two items together and click this third area, right? Why didn't you click the piece of bread and the peanut butter, make the sandwich, and then give it to the guard, and now the guard's walked off? Well, that's because there's a very specific set of instructions that you, the designer, wanted the player to do, and they did not come from the same perspective as you, right? Their life experience is different, the way they think is different, the information they have at hand is different, right? Something that was super, well, fairly common in those old point and click adventure games that really ruined it for a lot of folks is you needed to have memorized this one number in the first 10 minutes of the game. And by the time you get to the end of the game, you need that number. And if you didn't know that you need to memorize that number, play stops. You're stuck. And so we have to learn from those mistakes and make sure that we understand that our players are not going to put everything together the same way that we did. And that's okay. And I think that actually makes the game more interesting. But it does mean that we don't get a lot of mileage out of saying, okay, they're going to find out this thing in this place from this character, and they're going to find out this piece of information over here, and just dropping things all over the place. Right. Abuelo Sargar said, I love reading mysteries, but I hate running them. That kind of builds into the second point that we have to acknowledge when we're starting a mystery, which is when we read a mystery novel or watch something on TV or whatever it might be, the author knows what stuff is valuable, knows what information their characters need to progress the mystery, and so they put that in front of their characters. Either there's the implication that, the cop in the procedural has canvassed every single person in the apartment building to find out any information, and 90% of that was a waste of time because they just didn't know, but you just have to talk to everybody, right? If you're a real life investigator, that's something that detectives will often have uniform officers do is, hey, you two go and talk to everybody that lives in this building or on this floor or whatever, and just find out if they heard anything, they know anything, just any bit of clue that we can find, we desperately want. But your players don't want to run through that, right? It's a very tedious, boring thing. It's why detectives don't canvas. They have patrol officers do it, right? Because the detectives at least think that their job is much more important. They've got more important things to do. The patrol officers can waste their time canvassing. The other element that's super important there is the author puts all those things in front of their characters. And so they control the flow of information and they control what the reader is actually going to see and hear, right? I know that this character is going to go talk to this person and is going to find something useful out because I can control what that character does. But just like Abuelo Saragar said, your players are not puppets that you control that you move around the board. They have their own ideas, their own thoughts, their own way of doing things. And so that's where we jump into what my first point of how we want our players to get clues. Resist the urge to say, this piece of information exists here or exists over there, or that person knows it. Resist that urge. Something that is way more valuable to us as GMs is just write down the list of these are all the pieces of information that my players need to know, right? If it's an investigation, then they need to know that the bad guy walked into the building 10 minutes ahead of the victim, right? Of the murder victim. And they need to know that the murder victim owed a whole bunch of money to the mob. And they need to know that the person that runs the apartment complex pays protection money to the mob, right? And all of these different facts that they need to know. We don't say they're going to find out that the owner of the building pays protection money to the mob by talking to that owner of the building or talking to one of the tenants. We don't establish the criteria by which they unlock this fact. We just know it's a fact. You can also do this in the terms of like monster a week type games, like things like Rippers, where, okay, we need to destroy this creature. Well, we need to find its lair. We need to find out what it's weak to. We need to find out what we can use as bait. And so we have this list of here are the facts, right? We're going to hunt this werewolf. So we need to know that werewolves are weak to silver. And we need to know that this werewolf lives under the London Bridge. And we need to know that this werewolf has an especial affinity for people who they like flesh that is saturated in alcohol. So they like attacking alcoholics who are coming back from the pub. We have this list of facts. And then whatever your players say they're going to do next to try and find something else out, just pick the most relevant fact for the thing that they're doing. And that is the clue that they're going to find. Basically, no matter what, if they go to this place. Right? So if the players in my Rippers game is saying, well, I know this Egyptologist, and I wonder if they might know something about the weird text that was scrawled in blood where this werewolf's victim was. Well, it might not actually have anything to do with Egyptology, and it might not necessarily be super relevant, but we can flex our improv muscles a little bit, figure out, okay, how would going to this Egyptologist get them this piece of information A, piece of information A, piece of information B, whatever it might be, and then give that information to them, right? And there might be a role involved or some such. They might have some additional things that they need to do once they get there. If they're I'm going to go talk to this person. Well, this person doesn't want to give you the information. So now it's going to be a conversation. You're going to roll persuasion and things like that. And whatever they put down as this is how I'm going to try and progress the mystery, just make that where they're going to find their next clue. Because unless you're going for a super simulationist game where you want your players to actually feel like cops or whatever, where they are constantly having to deal with the frustration of dead ends and just not the information just not being there, it's not as dramatic and it's not as fun, and you only have so much time in your session. So while certainly sometimes you're going to want them to run into dead ends and red herrings and things like that, we'll talk about that a little bit later, you don't want that to be so prevalent that they question all the information they get, right? If I get 3 facts and I'm like, but did I actually get 3 facts or did I get 3 useless facts? And I have no barometer. Well, if generally speaking, when your players go and get a piece of information, that piece of information is relevant, and they know going in that generally speaking, I'm going to be finding relevant clues, and when you tell me these things, it's going to be relevant and useful, then they don't spend a whole bunch of time questioning the information that they have. And that helps them draw the conclusion that you're trying to nudge them towards, right? If my players have 4 pieces of information and 2 of the right pieces of information they're discounting because they think, that's just not it, and because I threw in 2 other pieces of information that were misinformation, well, that's a 50-50 shot as to whether or not they're using the information I want them to use or using the wrong information. So if we make sure that 90% of the information they have is the right information, then they're more likely to draw the conclusion that we want them to. And that's ultimately the hardest thing about running any sort of investigation or mystery, is we want the players to draw the right conclusion. Because sometimes if they draw the wrong conclusion, they go off the map and completely miss the rest of the adventure. And now all of a sudden we're having to improv a whole bunch of stuff that isn't relevant to the plot. Or they go into a situation thinking it's one thing and then kind of get the rug pulled out from under them. And sometimes that's fun, right? Sometimes you want your players to have the rug pulled out from under them and to blow their minds, be like, oh my goodness, I didn't see that coming, right? What a twist. But not all the time. And especially if you're starting a game where there's a lot of investigation and mystery and things like that, you want your players to have a bunch of wins before they have their first failure. Because if you start off with a failure, then they're going to be soured by the experience. They might want to stop playing. So that's kind of the first level of resist the temptation to exactly place where the clues are in the game and how they're going to get the information. Just know this is the information I need my players to have. And then whatever they do, whatever mechanism they try and use to gather clues, let that work. And later we can worry about jumping in and throwing in red herrings and things like that once they're more comfortable with the process of playing an investigation. I spent 2.5 years playing a game where we were paranormal investigators and the GM was a police officer. So now I could do a pretty good shot of running an investigation with zero prompting and kind of just, whatever bare information we have and figuring out how to hit the next bit. Most of your players aren't cops, aren't PIs, don't have any sort of background in investigation or research. They're just there to play the game. And most of their exposure is going to be things like police procedurals on TV and whatnot. So let's make sure that the experience lines up with that. And I see we've got a couple of folks subscribing with Twitch Prime. Thank you, High Level Games and Dersham80. Always glad to have the support. So we've talked about where the information should live in the world. But then the next natural step is when the players are getting that information, what should they be rolling, right? Should every piece of information be locked behind a successful skill roll or behind a series of skill rolls? You could, if you're playing Savage Worlds, you could use quick encounters for those as well. We've got, the networking and all these different systems that you could interface and use. But, and this is something that if you play Deadlands Noir, and I was actually talking to Clint Black about it a little bit last week, one of the important pieces of advice in that book is if your players need this information, don't lock it behind a roll. Because if they fail the roll, then they don't get that information. And then they don't have that tool that they need to progress and go forward. Now, I tend to take a kind of macro approach with this kind of stuff. I am very much, on the spectrum of should everything be a roll and cater to some sort of rule, to should it just be narrative and fun and we just make it up and we don't have to worry about the roles and the rules. I'm very much on this side of the spectrum. Which is not to say that that's right. I'm not trying to say, if you're on the other side of the spectrum, you're doing it wrong. No, it's as valid. But I'm giving you some advice, so you should know where I kind of sit on that. So my initial thought is always just, at the end of the day, whatever roles they make in whatever scene that they decided to do, right? We're canvassing, we're talking to this person, we've snatched this person off the street and we're interrogating them. Whatever they're doing, the roles aren't going to determine success or failure. It's going to determine how long it takes. It's going to determine how much resources they expend. It's going to determine if they get some false information in there as well, right? Again, depending on where your players are. Sometimes telling them a truth and a falsehood is actually pretty dramatic and useful and a great way to show off the fact that they, didn't do the best job of interrogating somebody, perhaps. Or they get some of the information, but not all of the information. But again, make sure if it's something they absolutely need to know, if you know that the next piece of the puzzle is them knowing what mansion in the countryside the vampire calls home, well, when they're going after that information, the role to interrogate the thrall that the vampire has, again, maybe it's not so much about whether or not where that countryside house is, but it's more about does he tell him about the hellhounds? Or does he tell him about the traps that are inside the house? Right? And then the players will think back and be like, oh man, if we had done a better job in interrogating that character, they might have told us about all these things that they probably knew. But you don't want to block progression, right? Just like when earlier we were talking about you have to remember this one code at the beginning of the point and click adventure game so that way you can beat the game. We don't want to have a hard stop at any point in our mystery or our adventure because there are enough factors working against us. Again, our players think completely differently. They don't have all the same information. They have an imperfect view of the information that they do have. So let's make sure that we have as few barriers as possible and don't lock that stuff behind rolls. But again, got plenty of other levers to pull, right? That my player says, I'm going to go and I'm going to talk to this criminal contact I have. Well, they make a persuasion roll, and then if that roll does not go well, they still get the information, but they piss that person off, and now they can't go talk to that person again. Or there were some tough guys with the contact, and you got into a bit of a fist fight. Now you've got a point of fatigue or something, right? Yeah, as I'm clicking on the wrong chat. As Abuelo Sargar said, for must-have info, if they fail the roll, I usually send someplace that gets them in trouble or makes them encounter an enemy. But after that scenario, they discovered the info, right? Especially if you're running a pulp game like Deadlands Noir, that notion of out of the frying pan into the fire is exactly the type of tropes that we're trying to pull. That's the lever that we want to be using all the time. So I fail my persuasion roll with the contact, and they tell me, okay, I can't tell you the information, but you can go and talk to this person. Well, if they'd succeeded at the persuasion roll, then they'd send your characters to somebody that is sympathetic to what you're trying to do. But in actuality, you failed your persuasion roll, so they send you to somebody that is probably going to want to kick the crap out of your characters. And now it's a combat, right? Now you get into a fist fight. And if you win, you can now get that information from that character. Another thing kind of in this avenue is remembering that your players don't have to always, the thing that they're interacting with doesn't always have to be the thing that gives them the information. So, for example, right, they're told, go and talk to this person. They go to that person, they start talking to them, and they overhear a conversation while they're waiting to speak to this, syndicate boss or whatever. And they overhear somebody else talking about something that is maybe not the information they were looking for, but information they still needed. And so when they fail to convince the syndicate boss, because you already kind of know that this is the result of them failing that other role, when the syndicate boss just jumps into a fight and they end up knocking out a bunch of people and not getting the information they need, they at least got that clue from that piece that they overheard. And so always think about the different angles at which you have to give this information to your players. And again, the useful thing is if I don't say X person has this information, then I can very easily take that clue that they weren't otherwise going to get because that's not the thing that they're hunting after and drop it into the scenario. So that way they're always making forward progress because that constant forward progress is the thing that's going to keep your players from getting too frustrated. Because definitely, I think the number one thing that you're constantly going to bounce up against when you're running mysteries and investigations is that player frustration, is that I can't figure it out. I don't know what we need to do. That's often, I find, a point where players will start asking the GM, like, what do we do next? I have no idea. But if they're always getting something, then likely they're not going to experience quite so much that frustration. That's the other reason we have to be careful about giving them misinformation and red herrings. Is if we have too much misinformation and red herrings, they don't trust any of the information they have. They don't know what next step to take. And it really stymies their ability to be creative and use the resources that they have and use their skills to figure out how are we going to get more information about whatever thing it is we're hunting, chasing, trying to find out about. So those are kind of the two big things that you want to keep in mind when you're setting up your adventure. You want to make sure that you don't assign things to specific individuals. Now, of course, everything's always with an asterisk, right? Sometimes it might be the exact right form of this clue or this clue that they don't need, but it'd be really useful to have. It only makes sense that they could get it from this one avenue. If that's the case, make sure you've telegraphed that, right? If there's a contact that your players have that they should leverage in this situation, well, it's not super difficult to have that NPC come up in the game somehow, right? They sent you a letter, they called you on the phone, they swung by the player character's base and dropped something off, just something to put that in front of the players and remind them that that is a resource that they have. And that way, you're not just expecting them to make this logical leap, but they saw, okay, wait a minute, we're hunting a werewolf, and didn't that character, isn't that character a monster hunter that we know and we interact with regularly? And didn't they tell us a story like 5 or 6 sessions ago about how the first thing they ever hunted was a werewolf? Maybe they know something that we don't. And that's how you find out, you need X type of weapon is super useful against werewolves, beyond just the general silver. If you do this thing, then it's going to be super easy to lure a werewolf into the place that you want and spring a trap on it. The other thing to always kind of keep in mind when you're running an investigation is avoid as much as possible completely unrelated threads having to be pulled on by the players. So what I mean by that is say a murder happens, right? And there's a pool of suspects that the players are going to be focused on and people they're going to be talking to. And in reality, you know that that's all a smokescreen, and it was this other relation that none of these people in this group had, right? Everybody in the apartment complex thought that the character that got murdered was just a normal person. And you have to get on this tangential thread to find out that no, they were in fact a member of the mob. Well, if that is kind of outside the orbit that your players are currently investigating in, there's a very low likelihood that they're ever going to latch onto that thread and pull it and actually start utilizing it because it's not in their consciousness. But again, just like we were talking about, there's might be an avenue that they can go down that they might not think of, and you should introduce it and put it in front of them. If we think about TV and movies and such, usually when that kind of out of nowhere thing happens, it's because they collide, right? The players are investigating and the mob is maybe looking for the money that the person they killed hid. And at some point, they're both at the same place at the same time, and those two threads collide. That's more dramatic. It doesn't require your players to make a leap of logic. And it also means that you can kind of guide when is that going to happen, right? Is the players finding out that this character had a mob connection something you want to happen in the first hour of the session? Is it something you want to happen almost at the end? Because, once they make that connection, they're going to go to the one character that they know that must be involved, and that'll be it. That'll be the investigation. You can always control when does that get pushed and introduced. And occasionally, sometimes your players will make that leap of logic. And in those instances, that is actually one of the best things that you can have happen, right? Your player jumps from where they are to some place that there wasn't a clear connection, but it's the right place. And that's exactly what you want, because then when your player is right, they're going to feel like a genius. They're going to feel like they got it, like they figured it out, they solved the mystery. And sometimes, even if they're wrong, maybe they should still be right. One of the things that you're definitely going to be flexing a lot when you're running an investigation or a mystery is your improvisational skills. And don't just apply that to the ground level, moment to moment things the players are doing, but also try and be flexible in the overall macro plot, right? I have seen so many times a player feel like they've just had an epiphany and they put together all the clues that we've discovered or that I've given out, and they put it together in a place where you realize that they're really forcing two bits together and the jigsaw puzzle doesn't quite look right. But that moment, that spark of like, I've figured it out. Oh my goodness, I've had this revelation. I find is almost always way more important than whatever I've figured out for this is what's happening, right? I know the answer is X, but the player is so enthusiastic about Y. Why not just make it Y? Right? So if there's a couple of groups that the player could say is the one who stole the gem from the museum and they're trying to find it, and they put together these two clues and they're like, oh, it's these folks. I know it. I'm 100% certain. And they're wrong. Well, if it doesn't cause too much overt damage and if it's not too much to finagle, why not just make them right? because your players won't remember all of the times where they just, they just kept playing and they got through it, and then eventually something resolved. They even won't super duper remember the times where they thought they were right and then were wrong. We generally tend not to remember the bad things that happen to us as well as we remember the good things that happen to us. But those players that have that epiphany moment and all of a sudden, they galaxy brain it and they figure out everything, they put the conspiracy together, that feeling is something that they will remember for a long time. And it is a story that they will constantly go back and tell. I've had this experience multiple times, and I've known many other GMs that also have similar experiences. And so if you can foster that and allow them to have that experience, even if they were only, so much, maybe as little as 75% right, at the end of the day, your players remembering that investigation, remembering that feeling, and having that moment of triumph is, I think, more important than anything we've written down. And we kind of have to also remember that. At the end of the day, yeah, maybe there's some sort of story we're trying to tell, or there's some structure that we have. Maybe, you're a GM that really puts a high importance on verisimilitude, and so you want the world to exist and the players to just interact with it. You don't want to ever change the world to your players. But I don't know. Your players talking about that moment for weeks, months, years later as one of their favorite stories, it's a pretty good feeling as a GM. It's pretty worth it. So don't just be flexible in the how you dole out clues and how they get access to it, but also be flexible in how they put everything together. And I know that sounds like it can sound like just basically don't have a plan, improv everything. To a certain degree, that's going to happen regardless of how much planning that you do. But just don't be too precious about the things that you've made up. Don't be too precious about how you think this overall web of lies and clues and information is, because the player's experience of it is the reality of it. Very rarely are you going to then, after the game is over, show them all of the twists and turns. And since they didn't play through it and didn't have the experience of those twists and turns, and they just had that experience of the frustration of never actually making progress, that's what they're going to remember, not how genius the mystery that you put together was. So and if folks have questions at any point, or like, how would you do X thing, just throw it out in the chat. Don't feel like you have to wait for the end to ask questions. But one of the last things I want to talk about before we're going to be at the point where I'm just answering questions is red herrings and misinformation. And really, I'm just going to be kind of repeating the same thing I said earlier, but it's a point worth repeating, which is don't overburden your players with misinformation. I would say a good balance is for every 2 clues, at least, every 2 clues that they get that are correct, you can then introduce one that is false. I would say to be safe, every 4 or 5 clues that are true, one can be false. Now, of course, we have multiple levers that we can utilize with this. One, when we do give false information, we can make it egregiously false, right? If we give egregiously false information, then the players are going to discount it more obviously and more quickly. And so they can get more of it, right? I know these 2 facts are true. This one is coming out of left field. Let's just that must not be right. That must be somebody's made a mistake or doesn't understand what they're talking about or has the wrong information. If it's very close, well, now it's going to require more information for them to discount this one piece, right? So if we've got 2 facts and this third one is kind of close, it might be true, it might be false. Well, I'm probably going to need double the amount of true facts that we have. So by the time we get 4 true facts, we'll be able to discount the 1 false fact. But then if you've given us another false fact, depending on how close these 2 are, now we're going to need 8 facts to discount those 2. And so it's very much something that snowballs. The more false information you give your players, especially if that false information is related and supports one another, the more correct information they're going to have. And don't forget, right? Most players in most groups are incredibly risk averse. So they will keep investigating and keep looking into stuff until they feel like they have a very solid grasp on all the correct information over here. And again, maybe that's fine. Maybe you have 13 weeks to run a single investigation for an adventure because your players are constantly having to run down the correct information and discount misinformation. But I don't want an investigation arc to last more than 4 or 5 sessions, and I only play for 4 hours at a time. So let's make sure that there's only as little misinformation as I need. And that's the other thing with red herrings. I find them to be more useful than just straight up misinformation. Here, you've got the wrong piece of information. It doesn't help you put the pieces together. A red herring is a lot more useful. The red herring being, we thought it was this, generally speaking, unlikable, seedy character that did the bad thing, but in reality, it was somebody else. But we're looking over here, not over here. And so we're going to run down our investigation as if it's this person. Every single mystery that you've ever seen has done this, right? They have at least 1 or 2 twists and turns for you to deal with before you get to the actual final mystery. Now, the reason for that, in part, is because it can be very, very hard to put together a mystery that you only put together at the very end. For the most part, you'll be, if you've got 12 clues to give out, you'll be at clue 4, 5, or 6 when your players are starting to look in the right direction. It has to be very obtuse and very well put together, and I said that accidentally because I saw John Doom's comment. It has to be very well put together and very precise, and something that is very difficult to do in a tabletop space because your players can just go anywhere. But it's very difficult to make them only go aha at the very end. So if you have more red herrings, what that allows you to do is have your players go aha, think they got it, find out that they were wrong, and then the key part there is the twist that you have at that point. You generally don't want it to just be, oh, this is wrong, and you've hit a dead end. Now, sometimes if your players are just going way off the rails and in a completely crazy direction, then a dead end is maybe what you need to get them to take a step back and reevaluate and go elsewhere. But generally speaking, a good red herring, they're going to realize we were wrong, but then have a different direction to go. Oh, that guy that works for the drug cartel that we're investigating for this murder didn't kill our victim, but they did steal the victim's money. And that character knows that character, that now that's how we find out that the victim was tied in with the mob. They didn't have anything to do with the drug cartel. They had something to do with the mob. It's never like, oh, the mob, and we've got a path forward, as opposed to just saying, oh, well, I just didn't kill him, and that's all you know. Definitely something that you can also run into that it's basically the red herrings and the misinformation the players give themselves, which is going to happen no matter what you do. But John Doom said, what about when you accidentally Matt Mercer over-describe some random tapestry and your players get super hung up on how this random tapestry has all the answers? Or, the chair is somehow much more important than it actually is. That's another reason why I generally lean on the side of giving less misinformation and less red herrings than most folks, I think, because my players are going to trick themselves. There's nothing I can do to stop them from tricking themselves all the time, besides making the mystery so bald-faced and obvious that they have to really not get it and really not be paying attention in order to trick themselves. So we can generally think, there's probably going to be 1 or 2 things in every. I tend to think in terms of scenes when I'm running a game. I think other folks would say probably use encounters or some of the language like that. But generally speaking, they're going to have 1 or 2 pieces of information that they latch onto in a scene that's just has nothing to do with anything. Again, we're going to require 2 or 3 or 4 facts to break them of thinking that was important. And so by primarily just giving them good information when they are tracking down a lead, we help with that. Candles 25. Candles 25 asks, jumped in late. I don't know if this has been asked already. How would you approach, for example, a ghost haunting in ETU? Well, so this is a haunting is a great example of a good way to have a mystery, right? So if we think, what are the facts that the players are going to need about this ghost mystery? Oh, sorry. Uh, I like 5 notifications, and I thought it was related to the stream because then there was a notification on Twitch, and it confused me. So what are the pieces of information that our players are going to need about the ghost? Well, they're going to need to know, where does it do its haunting, right? What causes it to come out and, kill people, haunt them, whatever, right? What's that trigger? So we know we have to have that fact somewhere, right? Whether or not that's going to be they get that information from going to the library and looking through the old newspapers and finding out that this person in life had a connection to, they were a mechanic. And so the way that they kill people is by possessing their car and running them over with their car, or they were a fisherman and they were their boat was capsized by some teenagers joyriding in jet skis, and so the thing that causes this ghost to get violent is college students having way too much fun, whatever it might be, right? But there's something that causes this ghost to start haunting, and we've got multiple avenues by which we can allow our players to know what's going on. Two, they probably need to know, what type of ghost is this, right? So is it, and this is kind of depending on, again, depending on how much you stick to the ETU stuff. Like, I'm always a big proponent of, I customize every setting that I ever run, just because that's where some of the juice as a GM comes for me. But for instance, my mind immediately goes to Phasmophobia, which is a I think early access game on Steam. That's all about, you're not the Ghostbusters. You're the folks that go in and figure out what type of ghost is going on, right? What is happening? And this is something that I think tabletop role playing games has really pushed, is the notion that, like, a poltergeist and a ghost are two distinct different things, even though for the most of human history we used all these words to mean the same thing. But if you're playing ETU, you probably have you're probably falling into that same notion of, like, a specter is different than a ghost, is different than a poltergeist, is different than an oni. um and so they need to know, what type of ghost is this, right? Is this a vengeful wraith that's looking to right or wrong? Is it, there's some other mechanism that is causing them to haunt? Were they brought forth by some sort of ritualist and their spirit was bound? They need to know whatever that type is. And again, we don't need to say, oh, they find out that information by going to X place and talking to Y person. Whatever they do, whether it's hit the books, do some research, maybe try and contact a spirit that they know, right? Whatever that might be, that can be the avenue they find that information. But we know they need to know that, because that leads to, how do they put that spirit to rest? So we need to know who the spirit is, what type of spirit they are, how we put them to rest, and maybe, oh, where's my camera frame, where their resting place is. And so we have those 4 kind of clues sitting in our head, as this is the information that the players need to somehow get. And then it's just a matter of sitting back and letting the players talk about how they're going to figure this out. One thing we haven't really talked about, and maybe I took this a little too for granted, but when you start a mystery or an investigation or whatever, you need to have some sort of inciting incident that gets the players on the scent. Generally speaking, like, I was just reading an ECU thing that we're going to be sending out. I think we're going to be announcing it tomorrow. So check the ETU Study Abroad campaign updates if you want to hear about this ETU thing that you're going to be all getting access to. But there's basically, how does the study group get hooked into whatever is going on, right? Do one of them get haunted? Is it one of their friends? Something happens to one of their friends. They hear about it around campus. One of the things that I've seen done to great effect, and I actually really enjoy, and it fits with that kind of narrative. Let's pretend this is the X-Files or police procedural or whatever. Is the notion of a prologue, right? It's the pre-roll before the credits happen, and then you get to the actual player characters. And what you do is you create a couple of handouts for a couple of different characters, and you give those to each of your players. And it has who this character is, it has a couple of personality traits, and it has a basically stage direction. And you give them the setup for the scene, and you have them just kind of play these other characters. Now, again, if your group's not super roleplay heavy, then maybe this might not work as well for you. But the group I was playing in at the time was extremely roleplay heavy, and so we would jump in and we would play through basically the prologue that would generally end with whatever horrible monster of the week we were dealing with killing basically everybody involved, or almost everybody involved. And then we would get to the crime scene, right? Because we were playing paranormal FBI types. And we would, I wouldn't have even made us do rolls, but we would make our investigation skill rolls. We would use our forensic skills and whatnot. And then basically the GM would say, so all of that information that you got from playing through the prologue is what you get from studying the crime scene. So it's more interactive. The players are actually playing through it. And they, again, if they're role players, they get to play a different character for a little bit, which is always a little bit of fun. It mimics that structure of the before the credits, you get to see the monster kill somebody before the investigators hunt after the monster. And it also gives you a good starting point because you can start it completely dry, right? You don't have any real setup. You just say, hey, here are these characters, play these characters for a minute. And then you go from that to playing your characters. And because you already experienced that scenario, you already have information to start, and you can start thinking about, okay, how are we going to find out more? So, in the example that we're talking about here, a ghost haunting in ETU, I might hand to my players handouts for the college students that they are going to be playing that are messing around with a Ouija board because they think it's just fun and they're in a cabin in the woods. And then the ghost starts haunting them, and maybe depending on the severity of game that you're playing, maybe they all get murdered by the ghost, or maybe they get scared off, whatever it might be. And then cut from that to in the library or the lunchroom or wherever, your player characters talking to one of the now NPCs that had this experience, right? And so your players know that this conversation is important and that this is the plot, right? This is the thing that we're here to play. And if your players respect the unspoken, rules of the table, then they're going to say, okay, well, you spent all this time presenting this haunting for us, so we should probably focus on that, not say go screw and mess around somewhere else. And because we played through that, we know it's important. So you don't need to do a whole lot of other work to let your players know, hey, this is the adventure. Go after this, so that way you can experience the content I have prepared. So that's how I would probably handle something like a ghost haunting in ETU, right? I've got my facts that just kind of sit out, and I will dole them out as my players come up with interesting ways to use their skills and contacts and resources. I would use some sort of prologue or some such. I mean, if your players aren't super into role playing, if you have more audience member players that like to be there and experience things, then you can probably get away with some sort of long form description that you read to the players about this scenario. That signals to them that, hey, this is important, and then the investigation can begin. And from there, it's just a matter of letting your players be clever. I'm always a big proponent of, because I've been on the other side plenty of, I try and use my skill in a clever way, and I pitch it to the GM, and I'm like, this would really make sense for what my character would do and how they would go about this. And then because it doesn't check one of the boxes of how to get information, it doesn't yield any results. Well, if your player spent the time to think about how they would use this skill and they connected it to the flavor of their character and they put some description into it, then I'm of the mind, let them do it and let it actually have impact and be relevant and useful. Because again, those are the types of things that they're going to remember. Oh, my character did this cool thing with this skill that I wasn't sure if it was going to work, but then we got this clue. They're going to remember that. They're not going to super remember the fact if it doesn't work, but I would rather my players remember the good thing than not remember the bad thing. Uh, so yeah, and again, like Abuelo Sargar is saying, there's a dead body on the floor, bloody hammer lying next to it. Well, it looks like a gum wrapper in the corner. The players will spend 45 minutes analyzing the gum wrapper. Well, at that point, you've got two options, right? One, you let them go down their rabbit hole, and you let them have fun just over analyzing this one thing, and you don't worry about it. Or, right, well, maybe the gum wrapper, right? That wasn't important previously. It was just, maybe you initially thought that the victim was chewing some gum and threw the wrapper or whatever, right? Or it was just a bit of ambient thing that you said so that this room felt like it was kind of cluttered and dirty, and it was just one example that you threw out there to kind of set the scene that they didn't die in an operating suite. They died in this kind of trashy room. Well, maybe the gum wrapper is important, right? Maybe if you're playing characters that have access to things like forensics labs, maybe there's a bit of saliva on the gum wrapper. Maybe the gum is in the wrapper, right? They spit it in and they threw it, and then they murdered the person. Or maybe there's a third person that was there, that wasn't the killer, wasn't killed, right? Was hiding. That they dropped their gum wrapper because they're hiding in the corner, watching it happen, and now they've run off and they are not, they're not coming forward because they don't want to get killed either. Or it's a weird brand that you can only get in like a couple of these convenience stores. And so now they can go to these different convenience stores and stake them out and wait and see for somebody that maybe looks like they'd be big and burly enough to beat somebody to death with a hammer in the manner that happened at the murder scene. If you turn it into a hook, then the fact that your players spent a whole bunch of time on it is then valuable, as opposed to just saying, that time wasn't valuable. They wasted the time. We're going to have to keep playing for something meaningful to actually happen so we can progress. Candles25 said, one time I described a janitor's bucket being knocked over next to some demonic runes. And instead of checking the runes, the players spent the next 15 minutes asking about the bucket. Again, if we don't predetermine this is how they're going to get this piece of information, right? Obviously, the runes should give them some information. But maybe there's a clue or a fact or something later that the players could leverage in order that they were going to get later through some other means or skill check or whatever, that they can get now for the 15 minutes they spent on the bucket. And so now you're further along. And this is also kind of just a macro time management thing of, if I've got 4 hours to get through, say I'm doing a one shot or whatever, or I've got part A of the mystery and then part B, and I want to get through part A in this session, when the players spend a whole bunch of time on something, again, you can always say, well, you spend a bunch of time investigating the bucket, and it really doesn't seem to be relevant at all to what's going on. And you can be very bald-faced about that, right? You don't have to hide it or try and, at the end of the day, protecting verisimilitude in a mystery or investigation can actually get in the way of having fun. So just saying, listen, this does not seem to be relevant at all. That's a tool. Do you want to do that all the time? Probably not. But every once in a while, when your players will probably go in a lot of those situations, oh yeah, right, we're kind of focusing on something dumb, aren't we? There's all this other stuff that's way more interesting. But sometimes they've spent 15 minutes, you didn't tell them no immediately, and they spent 15 minutes on the bucket, and that's 15 minutes they don't have running down a more important clue. Well, maybe one of the other clues that they have is going to be revealed through that bucket, right? And that's really where you have to leverage your improv skills and really come up with something kind of out of the blue and really connect something in maybe kind of a stretched way. The other thing is, don't always feel like the way it has to connect is to an immediately useful piece of information. It can also point them to somebody, right? And that's very much something we see all the time in investigations. I need to talk to person A, but I don't know where person A is, but I do know where person B is. I'm going to talk to person B, and person B tells me I don't know where person A is, but I know person C knows where person A is. So I got to go talk to person C. But person C is difficult to get access to because they've been kidnapped by person D. And so now we have to find person D, hunt them down to get person C in order to now be able to talk to person A. It's a complicated, tangled web, but especially if you're running something like a noir game, that is what you want to leverage. The complicated web is a part of the game, it's part of the genre. And when your players kind of go through all the motions and finally get to the end, it's going to make talking to person A so much more valuable and so much more useful. I would also generally try and make sure that the value of information your players get is commensurate with the amount of effort that they put into trying to get that piece of information, right? It's super dissatisfying if we spend half the game trying to run down this one lead only to find out that the information is next to useless. And that if we did just this other thing, it would have taken us 5 minutes to get the same information, right? That's not dramatic. That's not fun. So generally try and make sure if they put a bunch of effort into it, it's going to be useful in some way. Boilo Sargar said, it's funny because in Deadlands, I run mostly mysteries or at least mysterious events, but I generally avoid mysteries in other settings. It's largely up to kind of your taste. For some folks, modern technology kind of the avenues by which we have to do things kind of ruins the type of mysteries that they're into, right? Something as simple as forensics, right? The fact that we can pull prints off of the murder, what's the term? Every police procedural uses it. The murder weapon. I don't know why I couldn't pull weapon out of my vocabulary. We can pull prints off the murder weapon, and so that discounts 99% of the planet when they don't have a print that 99.99999% of the planet when they don't have that one print, and so we can just discount all of these different suspicious people because we can get their fingerprint. That's not necessarily as fun to some folks, so they might run it in different timelines, right? For instance, Stranger Things is, I think, more fun in the 80s where it's set than it would be in the modern day because we've got way too much scientific instrumentation and things to measure and forensics and whatnot that would allow us to figure out that there are crazy things going on. The suspension of disbelief, the fact that nobody believes that all these crazy things are happening, a lot of it comes from the fact they don't have the same technology. Yeah, and that's also definitely true. Boilo Sargar said a murder mystery in a high fantasy setting can be very tedious because the addition of magic and other weirdness can increase the number of possibilities from manageable to near infinite. Right. Something that you have to watch out for is what tools do the players have at their disposal, right? If you're playing a game and the players have, the equivalent of raise dead and they can just talk to the dead person and find out what they know, well, now your mystery has to take that into account, right? It has to be, they came out of nowhere, they ambushed me, I never saw a face. Maybe I heard a voice, but that was it. Because your players have the ability to do that. Something like I'm forgetting the power name. Object reading, is it? I forget off the top of my head. It's legend, things like legend lore in D20 fantasy games, where you just find out the history of an object. A lot of that can just invalidate a lot of the investigating that players would have to do. So depending on the setting and the tools that the players have, you also have to kind of adjust for that. But that's something that's kind of super bespoke, and I don't necessarily have good, generally applicable advice for that. But yeah, like Ron Molotok said, I don't know, I got stabbed from behind. If you have to account for all those variables, that means there's a lot more work for you on the front end to make sure that the mystery is going to be interesting. And also, it kind of puts you in this awkward position where your players are going to expect raising the dead person and asking them who killed them, right? Or at least talking to their ghost is going to get them very useful information that's going to help them wrap this up quickly. Well, if you came in with the expectation that this was going to be a mystery and they're going to have to do a bunch of investigating and so on and so forth, but because of the abilities your players have, they come with the expectation that this should be super simple. Well, now there's a disconnect there. And accounting for that disconnect and making it so that that's not a quick, finish the mystery is going to be dissatisfying to your players. why did I take this power if the time where it should be supremely useful, it's actually not useful at all because it would have ruined the mystery. So that's one of those things that you kind of have to think about even before you get into the mystery is how do I account for that? And how do I make sure that my players aren't frustrated by me making their tools less useful because their tools would invalidate all the work I did in this mystery? And again, a lot of the times the answer is going to come down to you can't do that mystery that you wanted to do in that setting. But that's the other thing that I find super valuable about the whole leave where the players get specific pieces of information. One of the things that you kind of just generally as a game master should be ready to do is just pull the ripcord on something that you were planning, right? I don't think this is going to work for this group or this setting or my players because of X, Y, and Z. Let me pull the ripcord. But if I've got a general premise for a mystery and a general list of clues, then it's a lot easier to rip out all the setting flavor and to repurpose that later. And that means maybe now you have to you prepped half a session and now you have to prep a full other session because you had to pull the ripcord in that investigation session. But somewhere down the line, hopefully, you've got half a session prepped already. Abuelo Sargar said, it's fine line between making the player's skill useful and the player's skills invalidating the story. That's also something that, so I know you're just using casual language, but that's something that folks should also be wary of over-focusing on, is the notion of their mystery or investigation as a story. Because at the end of the day, and I've experienced this a bunch, where the GM is running the mystery, and the juice for the GM is how clever they were in their construction of this mystery. But at the end of the day, whether or not your players had fun is way more valuable than whether or not everybody thinks you're a genius for the mystery you put together. So I'm not saying that's what you're doing, Boyle Saragar. I'm just saying in general, always kind of be wary of thinking in those terms, just because it can kind of shift the priorities from making a thing that's going to allow my players to have fun over to making something that I'm going to be really proud of because I feel really clever, but because there wasn't a great way for my players to engage with it, they're kind of let down. So to sum up, we want to make sure that the clues that we have, generally speaking, can slot into whatever mechanism the players try and use in order to advance the story. We want to make sure that when they're rolling for it, we're generally just thinking about in terms of consequences, not as gates to information. So that way they're always making forward progress. You want to make sure that any vital information that the players need is not locked behind any sort of direct line of thought or role or anything like that, because if they need it, then you need to make 100% sure that the players get it. So whatever avenue is required, they need to get that information. Don't forget to remind your players of the resources that they have, either just by literally reminding them out of character or by reintroducing the resources that they have, the contacts and the information and whatnot, through other NPCs and environmental objects and things like that. So that way their memory is jogged that, oh wait, yeah, we can leverage that resource. And then make sure to avoid overly saturating your players with misinformation, so that way, A, they don't have to get a whole bunch of extra information to discount it, and B, they don't have the misinformation you gave them plus the misinformation they gave themselves. And make sure that when you are giving your players a red herring, it doesn't result in a full stop, but rather gives them a different direction in order to start investigating. Because at the end of the day, the number one thing that we want to make sure our players are always doing when they're playing an investigation or a mystery is making forward progress. Because the moment they stop, the moment they hit a wall, the moment they don't know what to do next, they'll start to get frustrated. And when they start to get frustrated, they start to disengage. And at that point, the mystery starts to fall apart and the session falls apart. So I hope that was useful for folks. We will be back next week. I just had the topic in my head and I forgot it. One moment. it was going to be another topic that works with ETU. Let me check the email thread. Did I write what the topic for next week is going to be there? Oh, goodness. It's going to be kind of in the same vein. So if you're coming next week, same time, 5 p.m. Eastern now, because we're in Arizona and Arizona doesn't daylight savings. So in order for it to be the same time for me, it's 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. Oh, actually, Grom Molotok. That actually does jog my memory what next week's topic is going to be related to. So, Altered Carbon, noir story, right? Twists and turns. Next week, we are going to be talking about how to build your game plot in so that there are constant twists and turns as you would see in a noir style story. I'm going to tell you the game system that I rip off all the time for how I construct noir style stories and how you can leverage that in other games and other styles that aren't necessarily your hard boiled investigative fiction type. So that'll be the topic for next week. Same time, Thursday, 5 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Pacific. I'll see you folks then.